All right, let's wrap up our discussion of the Phaedo and the theory of forms. So in the last video, we ended by saying, look, Plato does give actually two arguments proving that the soul is immortal, but both of those arguments rely on us accepting the theory of forms. And the only argument he's given us so far that we should accept the theory of forms is that recollection argument in the Meno that says, look, the only way to explain what's happening with the slave and his knowledge of geometry is that that slave has recollected that knowledge. And so there has to be a time before the slave was in that body where his soul was getting direct experience of these truths. And so that means he was getting experience of these perfect things, and we call these perfect things the forms. That's the only argument we've really been given so far that proves the theory of forms exists. And you might think, well, it's not a great argument because maybe Socrates was leading the slave too heavily in his questioning, right? Maybe Socrates was sort of giving the answers to the slave. At least that's what many people have criticized that passage for. They say, look, Socrates is actually giving him the answers. So this doesn't prove he recollected it. It just shows that humans are pretty good at putting information together if you give it all to them. Right? So if you don't buy the recollection argument given in the Meno, we need some other argument for believing the theory of forms exists if we're going to believe either of these arguments that proves the soul exists eternally. And the two biggest arguments that we see are the two arguments from language. So Plato says that our language seems to imply that something, like the forms must exist. And there's two separate ways in which our language seems to imply that something like the forms must exist. The first claims that all of our words have to refer to something if it's a meaningful word. That seems common sense enough. It seems intuitive, right? If you're going to use a word and that word means anything, well, then it's got to refer to something. And we use words that are abstract all the time. We use words that don't refer or seems to not refer to any particular object all the time. So go back to our little graph with the apples, right? We use an abstract word, just general apple. And when we use that word, we're not referring to any of the particular apples we saw in the grocery store. We're just referring to sort of this abstract object. And so Plato thinks these general conceptual words have to actually refer to something if they're going to be meaningful, and they're referring to the forms. Right? So for example, if you tell your friend that a desk is something you can write at and keep your books on, you're not referring to any particular desk. You're not saying that one in my room is what I'm referring to when I talk about a general desk. No. And so Plato says, for your word, desk there, to make sense, it must be referring to this general form of deskness, the essence of deskness, the universal property of deskness, whatever it is. Right? All of those are different ways of saying the forms. And so our language implies that the forms exist. Otherwise, every time we use these abstract words, we're referring to nothing and our language is nonsense. But our language isn't nonsense, right? We know what we're talking about when we say these abstract words to each other, so we must be referring to the forms. The second argument from language claims that we make claims about imperfection all the time, right? We make these comparisons which claim that an object is imperfect, whether we think we could be more attractive or the table shakes a little too much or whatever it is, right? We're making claims about imperfections. Now, here's the key part. Such a comparison, right? Such a claim that something is imperfect requires a perfect standard from which to make that comparison. In other words, imperfect compared to what? Right? You're saying that thing is imperfect. Imperfect compared to what? Everything you've seen in the physical world, everything you've ever experienced is imperfect in some way. So if you're going to make a claim of imperfection, there's got to be a perfect standard by which you're measuring it. And since it's not anything we've seen in the real world, it must be the forms, right? So since there's nothing perfect in this physical world, these claims of imperfection only make sense if we're referring to the forms as that perfect standard. Okay, so both of these arguments are a little bit difficult to get your head around, but hopefully they're making sense. In both cases, there's something we do when we speak, right? There's some practice we have in our language, and Plato's making the claim that those two practices only make sense if you're referring to the forms. Otherwise, he's not sure what you're referring to, and then your claims of imperfection or your use of abstract terms seem like pure nonsense. So if you don't like these arguments, if you want to refute them, what do? Well, you have to show that against number one, we're not referring to the forms, but we're instead referring to something else. And number two, you can try and point out what else we are referring to that is perfect. But I think Plato's claim that everything we experience in the real world is imperfect is probably true, so it's going to be a little difficult to think of a perfect object which we could be comparing everything to. Okay, so if either of these arguments work, then it seems like we should believe in the forms. Remember, if either of these arguments work, we have these and the addition of the theory of recollection from the Meno. Well, then maybe we can buy these two arguments that prove the soul is immortal. And so then we shouldn't fear death. We've gotten over Sebes' objection. And Socrates was correct to say that death is great because we'll finally free ourselves of the body. We'll get back to that state of wisdom or truth that we've been after this whole time as a lover of wisdom. And we will be able to continue that life as an immortal soul. Okay, so what's our overall conclusion? Right? Remember, we've been building something the past couple weeks here. So whether or not you buy all of the arguments we've given over the past 2 weeks, we at least now have a robust picture of Socrates' project. And we have that robust picture along with Plato's additions to it, right? We have the problems and gaps sort of filled in this week from the Meno and the Phaedo. And so here is sort of an overall summary of the process we've been piecing together over the past 2 weeks. And so in order to live the good life, we must gain knowledge about the virtues, since Socratic intellectualism tells us that knowledge will in fact lead to right action or living in accordance with the virtues. And luckily, we've always had this knowledge since our immortal souls used to exist in the same realm as the forms and the forms of all the virtues. And also the process of dialectic from the Euthyphro allows us to eliminate all of those false beliefs we have and uncover that innate knowledge of the forms. And so knowledge really does lead to the good life, as Socrates claimed last week. And so you can see all of the pieces put together here. Right, Socrates' process of elimination eliminates our false beliefs, uncovers our true knowledge of the forms, and then since we can only act from what we believe is best, if we have knowledge of the forms, we'll act from that knowledge of the virtues, and then we will live a good life. And so that is it for this week, and that's it for Plato's project. There is a little bit more about the forms in the Republic. The Republic is where the allegory of the cave comes from. And you'll read most of the Republic next week as we get into Plato's political philosophy. So you might be able to pick up on additional little bits to round out your knowledge of the theory of forms when we get there. But you do have everything now. You have all the pieces in place to understand Socrates' project and the theory of forms. And so that is it for the week. Thank you, everyone.